In this video, we're going to talk about contracts, just, some of the things that you might come across when you're looking at negotiating a contract for a company. And this is for employment agreement mostly. But it does apply more broadly as well to negotiating anything. So there's in US law anyway, there's a difference between civil and criminal law. So civil law is something that happens between two companies and is usually or two companies, two people or companies or whatever. And it doesn't necessarily mean there's a criminal act, but there is some sort of tort violation. Now, that's different from criminal law. So, like, if you're breaking the law, you're, for instance, stealing from someone. Um, if you're stealing from someone, that's actually something that the district attorney would be looking into, pressing charges, and you'd be dealing with, jail time or something possibly. But a civil offense could be something like, it's between two neighbors and someone cut down someone else's tree. Like, no one's going to jail for that. Someone might have to pay a fine, or someone might be liable. Remember that word, liable, for something. Um, so one of the things to really understand is that if it's not in writing, it isn't binding. So when you're looking at agreements, don't talk. I've encountered a lot of people who talk about, oh yeah, we have an agreement that this is how it is, but if it's not written down and two parties haven't signed off on it, it isn't binding. This is especially important when you realize that that means that conversations can generally not be binding. So, um, this is just a general practice rule. When you talk to people and you have a meeting, follow up on that meeting with an email that talks about the contents of that meeting. Not only is this great note taking, but in certain cases, they can really save your bacon when it comes to who said what and when. Make sure that when you are doing things, or if you want there to be accountability, make sure it's written down, and recorded somehow. A second piece of advice is, like, don't cash checks until you have them in your bank account. I cannot tell you the amount of people who have been like, oh yeah, the money is gonna come, blah blah blah, and then it never does, and then you've made decisions. So decisions based off of the that money coming in. You can take risks if you need to, but realize that that's a risk. And if it's not money in your bank account, it's not real. Um, Businesses are businesses. They're there to make money, not friends. There is. Unless it's a nonprofit, of course, that those are in the business of helping people. But unless it's a nonprofit, businesses are there to make money. It doesn't matter, I don't know if you've noticed this, if you watched, like, some of the more popular bidding venture capitalist shows. But if you haven't noticed, there's this tactic they do, and it's one of those things. I think it's one of those dating techniques, negging, where you insult someone's business, or you insult someone in order to get, like, a date or whatever, and but then making them feel vulnerable, and then you step in and feel like, and then you step in with a compliment or something. This is something that I've seen in a lot of those shows. I don't know if it's just the clever editing or whatever, but a lot of times, when there's a business that everyone's really invested or thinking about buying, and then there's, like, a lot of competition at the end. A lot of times, right at the beginning, they'll start, like, insulting the company, or backhanded compliments, and they'll find things that are wrong that in other cases they didn't really care about, because they wanted to come up with something to say negative about them. They do that because it's just, a good psychological trick in business. And you've got to be careful about that. So when you're thinking about things, don't think about it as friends. You have to think about it as a business relationship. So, as in regards to that, arbitration, right? So, So arbitration is something, binding arbitration versus non-binding arbitration. Basically, this is the right to go to court. Arbiters are people who are, maybe judges, but are being hired for less money than it would take to impanel a jury in a civil trial. Arbitration is handled outside the court system. It's kind of one of those things that, hey, maybe we'll have let's have a sit down conversation with like a couples counselor, a mediator. Sometimes the mediator is bought by the company. Sometimes the mediator is, a shared expense. But binding arbitration means that whatever the mediator says is the thing, and then you don't get to go to court. So there's a lot of controversy right now about arbitration in general. Can you give away the right to sue someone, especially when it's a company, right? Like these are employers. A lot of companies will say, hey, especially in light of a lot of the human resource issues that have, basically a lot of sexual harassment and stuff. I, I wouldn't put it past a lot of companies to start working in binding arbitration as part of their workplace rule set. And so I would be careful of these clauses. I think they take away your rights and powers, and it's something, and I think a lot of those kind of moves and arbitration clauses and things, there's a lot of the I think binding arbitration clauses really give fuel to the fire for arguments about unionization. And regardless of where you come down on it, it's kind of taking away the rights of citizens to interact in a legal system. And you don't really have a choice generally. A lot of companies might hold the power in this, and they might be unwilling to bend. So what do? I guess you just don't work in the industry. So a non-disclosure agreement. These are pretty normal. You want to read through them always, but a company is probably going to have you sign one of these if you enter the building. It protects both parties or one party. It's unilateral or bilateral. So you should typically sign them, but make sure that if you can, make sure they're bilateral. If you can, make sure they're bilateral, and you should sign and make sure you read through and make sure no one sneaks in anything like extra clauses. So you may also come across something called a work for hire agreement. A work for hire agreement is going to be like a small contract. It's a term for defining a scope of work. Like what is it that I'm going to make? This is usually for a client. And this is something that if you're working in like, a very small scope, like I would like a bejeweled clone, please. One of the things that, and one of the things that you have to do is define your scope. Think about your contract really carefully, and when you're writing things down, write down hard facts. So what I mean by this is, if you write down a goal which says this game is going to be extremely fun, right? Well, that's a really subjective term. What's fun? What's extremely fun? Um, if that's a bullet point deliverable, then they may be able to give some and if that's a bullet point deliverable for a contract, that could actually really mess you up, because then a company could, if they're looking to keep the money for themselves, might not be they might take the game but not approve it. So when you're writing these in, you want to make sure that you write in like exactly what it is you're doing, as much as possible. You want to write also how many revisions that you're going to do per milestone, how long you should expect to hear back for feedback. So like if you don't hear back in 2 weeks or a month on a milestone, it should be automatically approved, opposed to like sitting in limbo so that you don't ever get paid ever again. Okay, so a confidentiality agreement is a little bit different from a non-disclosure. What confidentiality means in this case is it's usually like a clause inside of a contract, and what it means is you have to keep everything secret even after you leave. So you can't like talk about how the company operated, and depending on the egregiousness of what it is that you're sharing after you left, you could get into trouble, especially if it's like a trade secret or something. a non-competition agreement. So this is something that a lot of companies will ask you to write and sign. There's not really much you can do about these usually when they're in your contract. It's usually something that you just have to kind of do afterwards and then fight back. At least for that's my experience. I think maybe yours might vary, and you might want to consult someone if you're looking at a competition agreement, like suit or something. Like definitely contact a lawyer who has much more experience. But what it is uh, but a non-compete says that you can't work for another company. So, if you worked two jobs before, at rival food chains, you can't do that. I know some people who have worked in the cell phone industry. There's like non-competes in there, so it might be something you're familiar with already. But you can also not be able to work after a period of years. So it's sometimes regional, like you can't make a new company that's in the same state or same country, depending, I think country is a little bit broad, but, so like for instance, if you signed a non compete with a pizza joint and then you quit or were fired, and then wanted to open your own pizza joint, you might have to wait a month or a couple, a time period. It could be that and it could be just a pizza joint in the neighborhood, or maybe it was, a giant pizza chain restaurant that fired you, and the non-compete, and you're, the COO, and you have industry-specific non-compete, so you can't open a pizza chain. Period. Or maybe food even. There's this the courts made what they call the five pronged test, to make sure that it's a reasonable thing, because basically what happens is if a person who has a trade and is limited to a region because they live there, right? A lot of people live and work in the same place, and they can't necessarily just move to a new place just because, especially in the video game industry. Like it's not, if you're going to be in a more remote area, you're going to be working for one. Maybe there's another company there, maybe. Um, so you'd have to open your own company or whatever. So they have to judge whether or not the length of time was reasonable, how the area was covered, the fairness of the protection accorded to the employer, the extent of the employee's opportunity to pursue his or her occupation if the restriction is enforced. And that's where it really gets down to it is, if you can't do your job and then you can't like live, then that's a really huge restriction on your ability to work and be happy. So a company hypothetically has something to hold against you, that could be very damaging. So that could be really unfair depending on what position it is. So you might also see exclusive employment, moonlighting. You may not have another job. You may not, a moonlighting agreement specifically restricts you from creating products that compete with the products that are at the company. I have seen a lot ones where the rule is like if they make digital things, you cannot make digital things. I have seen one moonlight contract where it said that that even things you design in your personal time at home are considered company intellectual property because of reasons. Maybe because they own all of your brain trust. So and from the employees who have signed something like that, there's a lot of people who um, uh, have to keep quiet about their projects, or definitely don't discuss them at all at work, which is generally good. You don't want to cross the streams or anything, but in general, when you're working with a company and doing things on the side, you want to be as separate as possible. But things happen, and also colleagues, you talk with them over lunch or whatever. It's sometimes just idle chatter. So you probably can't do much about that one. Termination. So there is usually a responsibilities that you have to the company, and there's like a 2-week notice period or whatever. You'll see this Don't think for an instance that the company has to do any of the things that it says in the termination steps. Like if they want to remove you the day you turn in your 2 weeks notice, and they're like, well, you know what, we don't need you, goodbye. They can do that. So you want to be kind of so this clause this clause is important to review when you're leaving, especially if there's some sort of external benefit, like unemployment, or something, or just a good reference, perhaps. That's definitely, if you want a good reference, you probably want to turn in your 2 weeks notice. But a lot of companies may just decide that's okay. Maybe you're so you have to be able to, turn your 2 weeks notice, but just realize that like the company may not need to honor that. Just be aware, and be careful when you're thinking about leaving a company, especially if money is tight and you're living paycheck to paycheck. So, ownership of inventions. So one of the things that every contract that you're going to see, especially ones where you're a contractor, is the ownership of inventions. So this is really important, to make sure that you write and figure out who owns what when you're working on things, and it's very normal. So this one, like, definitely review, but this is a very normal thing that you probably see in a lot of contracts, and all it says is who owns what. And so when you're working on this project, you're going to get paid, and because you're getting paid, by the way, there has in a contract there has to be an exchange. There can't be just like one person giving someone something. That's not a contract. There has to be a give and a take, in order for it to be a lawful contract. And there's other things that are required, but so when you're exchanging money for a service or a work product, you're going to give that over to the other company. So sometimes you can work it in so that you have co-ownership or something. So for instance, like I have a contract that I have a contract with a very big business, but they're not really interested in the source code of the project that we're working on. So we're going to share ownership of it, and because of that, that brings the cost down for how much they need to pay me, because I'm going to be able to then reuse that work for other projects in the future that I know are coming up. So it actually kind of, allows me to do two birds with one stone instead of writing it from scratch again. There's another thing that I mentioned a little bit earlier: employee versus contractor. So, and some people can be kind of confused, especially when companies out there are not listing their positions very well. But a contractor is someone who is outside of a business structure. The employee is someone who works for a business. So there are three ways to figure it out. Does the company tell the worker where they have to do the job? So in some cases, for instance, if you have a job at if you have a job at a software company, and they say, hey, we have core hours between 10 and 4. So you have to be in during 10 and 4 every day. That's definitely a big marker that you're an employee. Even if they say you're a contractor, that sounds like an employee in a behavioral way. So you have to judge it from multiple ways, but in that way, it would be a behavioral way. So does the contractor, can they do their job from anywhere, or do they have to do it from a specific place? So, if you're going to contract a company to do work for you, you're not going to tell them, okay, company, you're going to have to come into my office every day to come work. Like, no, they've got their own office, and then maybe they take a day off or whatever. It's not up to you to decide. Financial. So how much of the job is controlled by the payer? So like, who is paying for what, and how that works. Also, how much the contractor is paid. So also like who's providing tools and stuff. So if you think about it, like, okay, So now that we have a contract, who buys the computers or who owns the computers and who's lending? Is there a lend of computers to another place? All of those can be part of a financial arrangement. And sometimes that's just like, oh, we have a specialized tool we're going to lend you, and that makes sense that they might provide something. But typically, you would be providing all of your own computers and all of your own software licenses, which can be expensive. So it's just something to take a look at. And then the type of relationship. So, like, are you getting insurance or vacation pay? Those kind of things are all employee benefits. They are not contractor benefits. Contractors get a price for a thing that they provide, either a service or some sort of tangible set of milestones. There is this IRS versus employee contractor. I'm not going to open it up, but there's a lot of that on the IRS website. You can take a look. So at will employment is something that you're going to also see in most states. I think it's 48 states is at will. Most of the United States is at will employment. That means that you can be fired for any time without any cause, without just cause, without any warning. So if you've ever worked at a company that has a set structure policy for how to fire, so usually big corporations, there's multiple warnings and there are write-ups and all of that kind of stuff. Most of that is instilled into the structure of a firing, mostly because they're worried that their employees may run afoul of because they're worried that their employees are going to run afoul of some laws prohibiting firing based off of gender and race and a number of other factors. But generally, you don't have a job if your boss thinks that your tie looks silly. Then they can fire you because of silly tie syndrome. Um, you know, so you that also has the double-edged sword of you can quit at any time. So those we were talking about termination and 2 weeks notice. You don't have to follow that. There's no, like, it's at will, so you can leave the company the same day and just say, hey, I'm out, goodbye, send me my papers. They may not like that, but and they may tell you to your face that you're not allowed to do that, but you totally are allowed to do that. It's at will employment, unless there's some really wonky thing in your contract that prohibits you from doing so. So a licensing agreement. So this is a term for contracts between companies when you want to take a franchise and you want to do something with it. Uh, so think about this, like if you are an author of a fantasy children's book, right? You write books, you're really good at that. Maybe you're really good at giving public speeches as well and doing reading. So you have a really great intellectual property that is in book form, and you're a writer. Maybe you're now in your 70s or whatever, and now you're in your 70s or your 60s or whatever, or maybe even you're just writing, you're still writing, and what you want to, and maybe you want to make a video game out of it, right? Well, do you then change gears, try to learn video game design or how to run a video game company, start up a video game company? What about wrapping paper or stuffed animal toys? So there are a lot of opportunities out there where you can sell your intellectual property, or license it to a company, and that company, and this is how publishers work. So like Sega talks to Marvel, and they say, "Hey, we want to pay you an X amount of fee to take the Captain America license and work with it, and we're going to spend money on developing a game for it and multiple games. But we're going to get the rights to Captain America, and then we're going to make it, and we'll get all the money for it. But you guys get a lump sum, or maybe there's even the royalties or whatever, right? So that's the way we can quickly grow a business. Now, Rovio, which owns Angry Birds, they actually didn't do licensing agreements with a lot of their stuffed animals, and it's one of the reasons why they had a huge cash inflow because they really kept a really good hold over how they were licensing out their stuff. Sometimes people can license out their video game content, and that might be an exclusive right license to all stuffed animals ever, and it's just to this one company who may or may not be doing a lot with it, and then you might be locked in. And then you may not get money, or maybe it was a lump sum to begin with, so it doesn't matter how the stuffed animals do, and that's the kind of thing that a licensing agreement might take care of. So, terms of service. This contract limits your rights about what you can do with things. You can't resell software typically. But you if you bought a pinball machine, for instance, at a yard sale, you can totally do that. You're allowed to buy things secondhand. Software is kind of the exception, and a lot of digital goods are exceptions to this, which is something that we're dealing with a culture. Um, Terms of service also limits your rights, what you can do with things, or attributes rights. So there was actually recently in the news, Blizzard had put into their new terms of service for the Warcraft 3 engine. Specifically for the tool set that said something along the lines of, from the article I was reading, the terms of service was saying that any mods or intellectual property you create within their engine, within the StarCraft editor, or excuse me, within the Warcraft editor, is their intellectual property. So, like, I think what they were trying to do is, if there was another Dota creation like that happened in the Warcraft 3 editor, the original one, that they would somehow be able to maintain rights to that. So, terms of service can be something we agree to by clicking through it really fast. But if you don't read it, there are things in there. So there are things in there. So if you're a company, you might want to put things in your terms of service, and you might want to talk about that, because also, like, think about maybe behavior within the community, right? You can put in your terms of service the expectations of behavior. Sometimes people talk about free speech or something like that. There is no free speech inside of a video game entity. Like, these are all private businesses, even Twitter, or anything, like all of the companies, they are allowed to police their own networks, and they're allowed to do whatever they want on them, basically. Um, so, uh, so there are ways that companies could, for instance, combat disruptive behavior or trolling behavior if they so chose. So, how to get paid? One of the things I want to mention, especially if you're pursuing small contracts, is put dates and times into everything you're doing. Make sure your milestones have a date. Make sure that the milestone has a review from the submission. Um, uh, um, uh, uh, you want to make sure that you have a calendar. Basically, if your calendar is strong, and in your calendar and milestones, you have deliverables that are well organized, and you meet those deliverables, then you should be able to get paid pretty quickly. You should also think about whether or not you want to withhold future builds due to lack of payment. So if there's a company that, like, hasn't been very responsive, or hasn't paid you yet, you can maybe withhold a build, if that might be a move that you might want to try to take if you're trying to get money from them, depending on what the relationship is. Definitely one of the things to do. Another aspect of this is also keep track of all the things that you're doing when you're working on things. Make sure you establish a paper trail. This is one of the reasons why it's really good to use task loggers, task trackers, and then to hit the, like, record button, or like to estimate your time into each object. There's a lot of ways to do it. You could even just use an old time stopwatch if you would like, and put it in a paper log, but write it down, and maintaining that log is your way to getting paid. So, or at least to have a small claims suit against someone, if they're withholding payment for some weird reason. So, there's a project collaborator agreement. This isn't necessarily a legal thing, but it's something that I recommend that everyone do. It it should outline, especially for the teams that are working for free, they're all just working for sweat equity together. You should all outline what you're supposed to, what you're doing and who owns what, and collaboratively how everything is going to work. So this one is one I did a very long time ago. Um, and so, excuse me for the if there's any typos in there, it's probably one or two. But basically, what I'm going over is all the, this is the important part is in the middle there. All contributions to the project is owned by what entity? Solely owned by who? So is it the one person? Is it a group of people? And, owned by, like, maybe you haven't established an LLC and split it up. It is good to write this down anyway because it shows intent, especially if you all sign it and or initial it. So who owns the right to exploit the work? What work is being done? So if I am an artist and I draw a cute little character, and I'm contributing it to the project, do I get the rights to make stuffed animals for that character on my Etsy store? Or do I have the right to print them out into 3D figurines and put them on my Etsy store? Both are really cool, by the way. You can go do a lot of grab a lot of those. Etsy still has some really cool stuff on there. But also, like, what about the sequel, right? Like, if you came up with the story and all the characters and the overall design, if you came up with everything about Halo, but then you didn't get any money for Halo 2 because you didn't work on it because they fired you at the end of it, that's kind of weird. So you should, especially if you're kind of contributing to it all with sweat equity. So you should write down um, uh, how it works and how people leave as well. Sometimes people want to leave, so they should be able to everyone should be able to negotiate that at the time. You might uh, also write in this collaborator agreement team expectations, responsibilities, that kind of thing. So write up something is better than nothing. And speaking of negotiation, so negotiation, sometimes people talk about it like it's a thing where everyone like sits in a boardroom um, and negotiates for an hour and then we're all done and we all walk out. Negotiation is a process. Um, it is no matter what you're doing. If you're talking to another company or if you're trying to get a raise or if you're trying to get a job, it is a set of discussions that happen over time and allows you to position yourself or your company um, uh, uh, as best as you possibly can. So, if you're talking about negotiation from a salary, try your best. Sometimes they'll be like, "Well, what do you expect to earn?" That is a kind of I think kind of a mean question to ask an employee. It really should be on the company to offer it, but they're not gonna. It's something that you will probably have to try to maneuver yourself to make to allow them to offer at least a range, but that, or you need to do your good research on Glassdoor and or on other salary websites to figure out like what is an average salary for that company in that region for the job you're going to go for. But if you s- so there's two sides of this. If they lowball you too much and they allow you to work for way too little, they're gambling that you're not going to figure it out and or go to another company a year later. Which, if you remember, costs a lot of money to hire, right? So at the same time, they may bring it up a little bit, but they're working on trying to give you as little as possible. So let them decide how much they're going to try to offer you. And then, be willing to say no. Cause like, also, and this is another thing, if you're not earning enough, like If you're not earning enough, then wow, maybe it is something that you are going to struggle at that company and you're not going to do well, just, personally or emotionally if you have bills to pay. So, it's doing your company a disservice not to argue for yourself. Even though negotiation can be really uncomfortable, saying, hey, I want more money. Sometimes other things can give, right? So, if you're at, and sometimes you can ask for things like, hey, maybe I can work for home. I had a friend of mine who works for a major company and they work for home from 1 day a week at least. Sometimes more, but like, on slow weeks or whatever. But she has it in her contract that she can work 1 day at home. And that's because like commuting can be like an hour, hour and a half for her, and that was just part of it. Like, hey, I can't live anywhere close to this company. It just costs too much based off of where it's at. And the commute's going to be a bear. So let me work from home at least once, once a week. So, you can also consider things that might just not be standard, but could be standard for you. And some companies might be completely inflexible with this. Some companies might be very flexible in giving you things that you want that are basically for them not really uh, like a big deal, right? Like, oh no, not Friday. Like maybe they have to schedule all the meetings when, a little bit more conservatively, but whatever. So again, so stuff to ask for: vacation, working from home, childcare. Oftentimes could be something to ask for: more money. Moving expenses, especially if you're moving far away to a new job, that's something that most companies would pay for, and it's really reasonable. Like, you would be amazed at how little money or how much money it takes to move like a two-bedroom apartment across the country. That means just like some beds and some, personal objects in, a 24-foot trailer. That's, thousands of dollars just right there. You may also be able to negotiate down or change the moonlighting exceptions that they might have. Maybe you want to try board games or something and you just want to say, hey, carve out an exception like, actually, I'm a hobbyist and that's how I stay passionate. I want to make board games. And so I'm gonna, if we're gonna work together, maybe they can flex. So that's all I have for this video. Other than that, I will see you in class.